Here is what most people covering this case got wrong. They reported the surface, the ring camera, the masked figure, the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman from her Tucson home. They reported the FBI involvement, the $1 million reward, the months of silence. And then when the Bitcoin story broke, they reported that too. The demand, the anonymous emails to TMZ, the claims about a hidden phone and a video. They reported what was handed to them. But there are layers to this case that did not make it into the standard coverage. Details that change the way you understand the timeline. Details that reframe who is doing what and why. Details that, when you line them up in the right order, produce a picture that is significantly more disturbing than the one most people walked away with. That is what we are here to do today. Not to repeat what you already know. To go further. Start with the Bitcoin demand itself, because it has been consistently misread. When the anonymous sender contacted TMZ asking for 1 Bitcoin, approximately $60,000 at the time, the immediate reaction from commentators and analysts was to treat the number as suspicious. Why 60,000 when a $1 million reward existed publicly? The assumption was that a legitimate source would know about the reward and pursue it through proper channels. The assumption was that someone asking for the smaller number was either unsophisticated or running a scam. But that assumption skips over something important. The $1 million reward was structured, as these rewards typically are, around cooperation with law enforcement, claiming that reward meant coming forward, giving your name, your location, submitting yourself to interviews and verification processes, making yourself known to the same investigators who were actively working a kidnapping and death investigation. For someone who was connected to this case, not as a random scammer, but as someone genuinely embedded in its orbit, walking into that process was not a viable option. $60,000 in Bitcoin, sent to an anonymous wallet address with no identifying information attached, was not a lesser reward. It was a different kind of transaction entirely, one that preserved anonymity, one that allowed whoever was making the claim to take money and disappear without ever having to stand in front of a federal agent and explain how they knew what they knew. When you look at the Bitcoin demand through that lens, it stops being a red flag pointing toward a scammer and starts being something considerably more unsettling. It starts looking like the financial strategy of someone who had real information and a very specific reason not to go anywhere near law enforcement to collect it. Then there is the question of what the sender actually knew and how they knew it. The public-facing claims were significant enough on their own. Names, addresses, phone numbers of the alleged kidnappers. A video of Nancy Guthrie with what the sender described as the main kidnapper on the last day of her life. A phone stored in a hidden location with specific coordinates and a password. But the detail that has not received enough attention is the revision. In earlier communications, the sender had referred to multiple kidnappers, a plural, undefined group. Then, in the communication that prompted the Bitcoin payment story to break nationally, the sender revised that number downward. Specifically, precisely, two kidnappers directly connected to the crime. 2 people, beyond the sender themselves, who would know where Nancy Guthrie's body was located. That kind of revision does not come from someone who is fabricating. A scammer constructing a story from publicly available information has no incentive to make their claims more specific and more verifiable over time. More specific means more checkable. More checkable means more exposure if the details are wrong. Someone running a con moves in the opposite direction. They stay vague. They stay broad. They give themselves room to retreat. The move from multiple to exactly 2 is the move of someone who knows something and is deciding how much of it to give away. And law enforcement, for what it is worth, had been operating on a similar assessment from early in the investigation. The prevailing expert consensus was that this crime required more than one person. The logistics of kidnapping an 84-year-old woman from her home, dealing with whatever happened after, and successfully evading detection for months pointed to coordination. Not one person acting alone. The sender's revised number aligned with that assessment. Not contradicted it. Aligned with it. Now consider the surveillance behavior. The sender was not just sending emails. They were watching. Closely. In real time. They were monitoring TMZ's broadcasts, tracking the FBI's public statements, and responding to specific things said on air in their subsequent communications. This has been reported. What has not been fully examined is what that surveillance behavior tells us about the sender's psychological profile and their relationship to the case. People who monitor coverage of a crime, they have no connection to do so out of curiosity or obsession or the particular compulsion that drives some individuals to insert themselves into high-profile tragedies. That behavior exists. It is documented. It is a recognized category in forensic behavioral analysis. But the way this sender engaged with the coverage was different in character. They were not inserting commentary. They were not adding irrelevant details or expressing emotional reactions to what was being reported. They were tracking specific investigative claims, specifically the FBI's assessment of their gender, and responding to those claims with the kind of measured, deliberate acknowledgement that suggested someone who was managing a narrative. Someone who was aware that every word in every email was being read not just by TMZ's editorial team, but by federal investigators. When the FBI suggested the sender might be female, and when that suggestion made it into the broadcast reporting, the sender's next email did not ignore it, did not deny it, and did not confirm it. They simply let it be known that they had seen it, that they were aware of what was being said about them, and that they were choosing, consciously and deliberately, not to resolve the question. That is not the behavior of someone who stumbled into this situation. That is the behavior of someone who understood that ambiguity was a tool. That keeping investigators uncertain about even the most basic facts, including the gender of the person they were trying to find, maintained an advantage. Sophisticated does not cover it. This was calculated. The metadata argument deserves to be taken apart properly because it has been treated as a simple point when it is actually a compound problem. The sender refused to provide a screen grab of the alleged video, citing the risk that any image sent would contain embedded metadata that could be used to identify or locate them. This refusal was widely cited as evidence of technical sophistication, proof that the sender understood digital security well enough to be cautious. That reading is partially correct, but critically incomplete. Yes, understanding metadata as a tracing risk reflects technical knowledge. But understanding it as a risk and using it as an excuse not to provide proof are two different things. Because anyone who understands metadata well enough to cite it as a concern also understands, without question, that metadata can be stripped from an image before it is sent. This is not advanced knowledge. This is basic digital literacy available to anyone willing to spend 20 minutes learning it. The sender, who had demonstrated the technical capability to anonymize their email communications well enough to defeat 5 FBI agents working with a media outlet's IT department, was not incapable of removing metadata from an image file. So the metadata excuse was not a technical limitation. It was a choice. And the question of why someone would choose not to provide proof, when providing stripped proof would dramatically increase their credibility and their negotiating position, only has a small number of answers. Either the video does not exist, or the video exists, but revealing even a single frame of it would expose something about its origin or its content that the sender was not willing to expose. Or the sender had a reason to keep the transaction in a state of permanent unresolution, a reason that served their purposes better than actually completing the exchange. None of those three possibilities point toward a simple opportunistic scammer looking for a quick $60,000. All three of them point toward something more complicated, something more dangerous. Subscribe to Case File Records right now if you have not already, because we are about to move into the territory that most coverage of this case never reached. The details that reframe everything. Hit the like button and stay with us. Let's talk about the timing, because the timing of this case is one of its most underexamined features. Nancy Guthrie disappeared on February 1st, 2025. The anonymous emails began reaching TMZ sometime after that. The exact start date of the first communication has not been precisely established in public reporting, but the pattern described in coverage suggests the sender had been in contact for some time before the most recent note made national headlines. By the time the Bitcoin demand story broke at a level of national prominence, the investigation was approaching its 5-month mark. 5 months of silence on the suspect identification front. 5 months during which the Ring camera footage remained the primary public-facing piece of evidence. 5 months during which a $1 million reward had produced no named, publicly confirmed suspect. And then, in the 48 hours preceding the broadcast that brought the full scope of the anonymous sender's claims into public view, a separate note appeared. Not to TMZ, not to a national outlet, to a local Tucson television station. And this note, unlike the Bitcoin demands, was not asking for anything. It said Nancy was dead, that her death was unintentional, that she was buried in nature. The FBI deemed it credible. Now place those two timelines next to each other. The local station receives a note the FBI finds credible, a note making definitive statements about Nancy Guthrie's death and burial. Within 48 hours, TMZ receives the most detailed and most aggressive communication yet from the anonymous sender, complete with claims about a video of Nancy on her last day, the exact number of kidnappers, and a renewed Bitcoin demand. That proximity is not nothing. It could mean that the credible note to the local station prompted someone, aware of the investigation status, aware that official channels were now working with confirmed information about Nancy's death, to make a final push on the Bitcoin transaction before the window for leverage closed. If investigators confirmed Nancy was dead and worked toward identifying and arresting the responsible parties through conventional investigative means, the anonymous sender's information would become progressively less valuable. Acting in the 48 hours after the credible note appeared was, from a strategic standpoint, logical. If you accept the premise that the sender had genuine information, which brings us back to the central question that no amount of analysis has been able to fully resolve: real information or an elaborate construction, connected to the crime or exploiting it. There is one more layer to add to this, and it is perhaps the most chilling element of the entire case when you sit with it properly. The sender claimed that only two people, plus themselves, knew where Nancy Guthrie's body was buried. If that claim is true, it maps onto one of a very limited number of scenarios. Scenario 1. The sender is one of the two kidnappers attempting to profit from information about their own crime while using the anonymization architecture to avoid identification. This scenario explains the sophistication, the precise number revision, the knowledge of burial location, and the reluctance to provide proof that might reveal the video's origin. Scenario 2. The sender is a third party who was present for some portion of events, but was not directly involved in the kidnapping itself. Someone adjacent to the crime who had enough proximity to accumulate specific knowledge without being one of the two primary actors. This scenario explains why they would know what they know while also explaining the financial motivation. They were present, but not responsible, and they saw an opportunity. Scenario 3. The sender has no genuine connection to the crime, but has, through some means not yet publicly established, obtained accurate specific information about the number of perpetrators and the fact of Nancy's death and burial. Information that happened to align with the credible note sent to the local Tucson station, and is using that information as the foundation of an elaborate fraud. Law enforcement was not publicly ruling out any of these scenarios. The FBI was working all of them simultaneously, because the cost of dismissing the wrong scenario was too high. If the sender was one of the kidnappers, identifying them could lead directly to the second kidnapper and to Nancy's burial location. If the sender was an adjacent third party, their information could still break the case open. And if this was a fraud, identifying the fraudster was itself a law enforcement priority, because perpetrating a fraud involving a kidnapping and death investigation, using false claims about the location of a victim's remains, is a serious crime. Every version of this story ends in the same place. Find the sender. The FBI's communication to TMZ, that they believe they were getting closer to identifying the person behind the emails, was not offered with a timeline. Getting closer in a federal investigation involving anonymized digital communications routed through multiple jurisdictions is a relative statement. Closer than yesterday. Closer than last week. But how far from an actual identification, and from an actual answer, remained something only investigators knew. What was knowable from the outside was this. The sender had constructed their communications with enough care and enough technical sophistication to stay ahead of federal investigators for months. They had used that time to build a body of communication, more than a dozen emails to TMZ alone, that collectively represented a significant volume of claims, some of which were verifiable, some of which were not, and all of which existed in that maddening space between credible enough to take seriously and unverified enough to remain uncertain. They had watched the coverage. They had responded to specific claims. They had revised their stated facts in ways that aligned with what investigators already believed to be true. They had demonstrated knowledge of the victim's fate that matched the content of a separate note the FBI deemed credible. And they had done all of it while maintaining an anonymity that, as of the point of this coverage, remained intact. That is a sustained and disciplined performance over a period of months. Regardless of what was true and what was not, that sustained discipline was something. And then the Bitcoin was paid. That is not the beginning of a resolution. It is the beginning of a new set of questions. Because paying the Bitcoin meant someone made a decision. A decision that required weighing the probability that the sender was legitimate against the risk of handing $60,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to someone who might be running a scam against a grieving family and an active federal investigation. Someone looked at all of that, the months of anonymous emails, the claimed video, the hidden phone, the coordinates, the password, the revised kidnapper count, the surveillance behavior, the metadata argument, the FBI's inability to trace the source, and decided it was worth paying. Who made that call, what the payment produced, what was found on that phone if it existed, and what any of it meant for the investigation into what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st, 2025. That is where this story goes next. And it is not a simple ending. If this breakdown gave you something that the standard coverage of this case did not, that is exactly what Case File Records is here to do. We do not repeat the headlines. We go underneath them. Subscribe right now so you do not miss part 2 of this case, where we get into what happened after the Bitcoin was paid and what it revealed. Like this video, it takes 1 second and it tells us that this kind of deep, detail-first investigative storytelling is what you want more of. Drop a comment below. Tell us which detail in this breakdown changed the way you were thinking about this case. We are reading every single one. Case File Records. Stay with us.